All right, let's move on to TikTok because Ryan, you actually have some original reporting here. This is unraveling in a crazy direction, and you have some audio actually.
Yes, and so it backs up this crazy exchange that between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Mitt Romney over the weekend, in which apparently they forgot that they were speaking in front of a live audience and were being recorded, and just got super honest. So now the audio that we have, you can excuse them a little bit because they did not think that they were not in front of a kind of public audience, but somebody leaked it to us. So we'll play that in a moment. But first, here's Romney and Blinken.
Why has the PR been so awful? I know that's not your area of expertise, but you have to have some thoughts on that, which is, I mean, as you've said, why has Hamas disappeared in terms of public perception? An offer is on the table to have a ceasefire, and yet the world is screaming about Israel. It's like, why aren't they screaming about Hamas? Accept the ceasefire, bring home the hostages. It said it's all the other way around. I mean, typically the Israelis are good at PR. What's happened here? How have they and we been so ineffective at communicating the realities there and our point of view?
How this narrative has evolved. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a good answer to that. One can speculate about what some of the causes might be. I don't know. I can tell you this. We were talking about this a little bit over dinner with Cindy. I think in my time in Washington, which is a little bit over 30 years, the single biggest change has been in the information environment. And when I started out in the early 1990s, everyone did the same thing. You woke up in the morning, you opened the door of your apartment, your house, you picked up a hard copy of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And then if you had a television in your office, you turned it on at 6:30 or 7 o'clock and watched the national network news. Now, of course, we are on an intravenous feed of information with new impulses, inputs every millisecond. And of course, the way this is played out on social media has dominated the narrative. And you have a social media ecosystem environment in which context, history, facts get lost, and the emotion, the impact of images dominates. And we can't discount that. But I think it also has a very, very, very challenging effect on the narrative.
Yeah, a small parenthetical point, which is some wonder why there was such overwhelming support for us to shut down potentially TikTok or other entities of that nature. If you look at the postings on TikTok and the number of mentions of Palestinians relative to other social media sites, it's overwhelmingly so among TikTok broadcasts. So I'd note that's of real interest, and the president will get the chance to make action in that regard.
Now, normally after a clip like that, we'd like to help people read between the lines because sometimes politicians speak in code.
Not there.
Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they tell you exactly what they're thinking. Another case is Representative Mike Lawler, who was recently in a private meeting with the organization No Labels, which is kind of a pro-corporate group that tried to recruit Joe Manchin and a bunch of other people to run for president. He met with some No Labels donors in a private Zoom with Josh Gottheimer, who is another kind of leader of the of No Labels, and this was what Mike Lawler had to say about his role and Congress's role in the TikTok ban. This audio was obtained by The Intercept. My colleagues Akela Lacey and Prem Tucker wrote about this, wrote about his comments, also calling for the FBI to investigate all campus protesters. But he also spoke about TikTok, which they mentioned. But I wanted to play this clip here.
As Josh pointed out, when you have Hamas, Iran, China endorsing these protests, it speaks volumes to the absurdity of them. It also highlights exactly why we included the TikTok bill in the foreign supplemental aid package, because you're seeing how these kids are being manipulated by certain groups or entities or countries to foment hate on their behalf and really create a hostile environment here in the U.S.
And so all of this is relevant because we can put up this third element. TikTok has now sued, as was expected, to overturn the law on constitutional grounds. First Amendment is very clear. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. Shall make no law.
Right.
Like it's a bunch of the Bill of Rights are confusing and vaguely written. What does it mean that a well-regulated militia allows you to keep and bear arms? Like they've been arguing about that for hundreds of years. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press is pretty straightforward. And culturally, the First Amendment has been upheld by kind of the American people who deeply believe in this idea that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of press. So according to Mitt Romney and Mike Lawler, Congress made law to abridge the freedom of the press.
Well, what's interesting about that is they seem to be talking about TikTok as though it is, and Blinken is especially interesting in this context. He's comparing TikTok directly to newspapers and, as he says, news networks. Now, I would actually disagree with that, and I think Section 230 is one of the big questions here about what constitutes a publication, what constitutes a news outlet. If you're just a platform, do you have the same roles and responsibilities as a newspaper? I think that's genuinely a major question, and I think it's heavily implicated in this conversation about the First Amendment and TikTok. The government is going to argue, for example, that you can say whatever you would say on TikTok. Nobody's right to say it. Whatever you were going to say on TikTok, nobody's saying you can't say that. You can just say it in another forum, just not on this forum. But that becomes, again, a pretty serious discussion about what the First Amendment actually means. It is, again, fascinating as well. We talked about in the Israel block, and actually we talked about all of this, we talk about this all the time, how avoiding the issue, saying everybody is either a bigot or they've had their brain poisoned by bigots. As you heard Mike Lawler argue in that audio.
Manipulating the young people.
Yes, that it's not, none of these sentiments are legitimate or part of sort of deeper worldviews. That is a huge mistake from Republicans and from sort of center pro-Israel people to just dismiss this either as bigotry or purely manipulation. And that's exactly what they're doing. I have like actual serious national security concerns about TikTok. I've had that conversation. We've had that conversation many times. But to be so dismissive is a huge, not just a tactical error, but an ideological one too.
And at least Lawler's comments are a little bit less reckless than Blinken's and Romney's when it comes to kind of a legislative intent perspective in when it comes to like giving away the game, because at least he's sticking to this idea that actually it's Hamas and Iran and China that are using the platform to manipulate. However, the law is specific to like China and a couple other countries. What he's really talking about the content.
Yeah.
Like what's so clear is that this really is content based.
Yeah.
And that means it's a violation of the First Amendment.
And you may remember when the Osama bin Laden letter went viral just a few months ago, and there was this panic about how the algorithm may have been tweaked by Beijing to get all of these young Americans to discover the bin Laden letter and post about how it really changed their perception of the U.S. in a negative direction. And I think part of the problem here is that is entirely possible and entirely problematic. That should be something that legislators are concerned about and they deal with, and that is front and center on their minds. But there was some really excellent reporting tracing the arc of virality in that particular place. And it looks like it had nothing to do with TikTok tweaking the algorithm and everything to do with organic sentiment among young people who were discovering the bin Laden letter for the first time and saying, oh my goodness, was it totally naive from my perspective? Yes. But saying, oh my goodness, this completely radically changed my perception of the United States. The evidence that it was organic and then maybe it had like a Streisand effect is
well,
strong.
You know what really happened, I think, from watching that whole bin Laden letter virality take off? Yashar Ali.
Yes.
Remember this?
Yes.
So he's a power Twitter user who identified this phenomenon.
International man of mystery.
On TikTok. And found like 3 clips of people doing this on TikTok. And he brought it over to Twitter.
Yes.
And shared it with the boomers on Twitter.
Yes.
And the boomers had a moral panic.
Streisand affected it.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so then that moral panic is what poured the gasoline on a couple of sparks.
It's a good Washington Post article on this.
Yeah, so the idea that China did it is kind of undercut by the fact that we know who did it. It was Yashar. It's like, he's the one that supercharged it. And I don't think, did he respond to that? Like,
I'm not sure.
I think he said, well, look, I was identifying a real phenomenon. It's not my fault that you all, panicked and freaked out about it.
The same thing, though, is true if you look at one thing that people like Lawler will point to is the breakdown in posts that are pro-Palestine versus pro-Israel on TikTok, to the extent that we can actually break that down. It's dramatically different. More pro-Palestine posts on TikTok than there are pro-Israel posts on TikTok. And that is pointed at and said, this is evidence of foreign manipulation. Again, it's entirely possible that is true, but there's significant evidence that shows that breakdown looks a lot like how young people view the breakdown themselves. And there was an interesting poll this week that found that the issue is not rated among the most important for college students, so they're more likely to say the most important issue to them is healthcare and education financing and all of that. Doesn't mean that they don't think that the United States and Israel are wrong in the conflict, because public opinion polling on that shows they do, and that the TikTok breakdown actually matches the opinion breakdown better than anything else.
Right, and it's all relative. So for Romney to say, there's more pro-Palestine stuff on TikTok than there is anywhere else, two things on that. People who post all the time about Palestine on TikTok will tell you, like, there is still significant censorship. There's so much censorship on TikTok of pro-Palestinian content that people, who were told that, the Chinese must be, juicing the stats for Hamas are like, are you crazy? Like, you go on here and try to post pro-Palestinian content and see what happens. But it's relative to these American companies that massively put their thumb on the scale. So China kind of just has their thumb on the scale against Palestinians less than the American and other platforms, which make it very, very difficult to push pro-Palestinian content through without being censored and shadow banned and so on. Setting that all aside, the way that Blinken and Romney frame it is just kind of incredible.
Just a PR problem.
How did we
just a PR problem.
How did we lose the narrative?
Should have hired Don Draper.
Just a PR. It's not the 34,000 plus killed. It's not the more than 14,000 children killed. It's not blocking humanitarian aid. It's not deliberately targeting a World Central Kitchen staffers. It's none of that. It's the fact that we used to have the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Evening News, and we could then shape the narrative that was being delivered to people. Now they can see for themselves what is going on. That they then follow that up with, therefore, that's why we banned that and are trying to go back to where we could put things in the bottle, is a moment of just such absolute self-unawareness. Is that a word?
Do you
Unself-awareness?
remember Obama pining for like the position that Xi Jinping was in? There was sort of like a fake. That's what he
and Trump agree on.
Yes. And this is Blinken pining for like the days of John Foster Dulles, where he could just
call up Time Magazine,
which he still can. He
but he
still
can't call up TikTok.
But it doesn't have the same. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have the same power. The last thing I'll say on this is, it's also, people are making the mistake of assuming this was the same thing with like the Russian interference, that actually, like, to the extent that it did happen, it was those silly viral memes and everything, that what China would want to do is to strictly advance the Palestinian cause in the United States, as opposed to destabilize public opinion. That's really what Russia was trying to do back in 2016, was sow discord. They were, of the memes, there were some really cheesy, awful right memes and some really cheesy, awful pro-BLM, pro-left memes. So even what their conception of what might be happening here is just in this sort of box, that it's either going to be China wants us all to be pro-Palestine because China supports the Palestinians. I was like, China just wants us at each other's throats, if anything. Like, that looks like the strategy. It looks like the long-term strategy is to weaken Americans' love of America, frankly, and to sow discord, which is similar to how Russia has approached it for decades, too.
And how Voice of America approaches it, Radio Free, or all of these.
You just had to do it.
Yeah,
it's not wrong. It's not wrong.
We love to sow dissent also, and prop up like civil society organizations that profess to have concerns about human rights. And So, nobody's doing anything new.
No, not at all. We will never escape the Cold War. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.